Qigong and the path to enlightenment. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So this vlog it's partly inspired by a conversation I had with a friend a little while ago, and it's also partly a follow-up to a blog that I wrote a little while ago on whether Qigong is a religion or not. So yeah, a little bit of a mix of both. And yeah, I'll start by telling you a little bit about this conversation that I had with this friend. So I got a contact from him a little bit out of the blue, don't see him all that often, wanting to talk to me about Qigong, just wanting to have a chat and discuss some things about it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Of course I'll have a chat with you about that. And turns out he'd been having or going through a few really tough things in his life, and so he was really interested in what role Qigong might play, essentially in finding some guidance, some direction in life as a whole. And yeah, this conversation, it was essentially, it was on a beach very similar to this one that I'm on now. I'll give you a show of the beach if we have a little look here. So, and yeah, not this exact beach, it was another beach just a little bit further down the coast, a little bit closer to town. So we went for a long walk on the beach and we talked for, in the end it was about 2 hours, about Qigong and how Qigong interacts and relates to this, well, to his interest in helping him to understand a few things about life, and in particular I guess helping him with some of these challenging situations that he'd been through and a bit of a hard time he'd been having. So yeah, it was a really good conversation, and like I said, we talked for about 2 hours, and some of you watching this vlog might be a bit interested by that, because some of you I know will have noticed that I don't often get into talking about what people might, often think of as spiritual things. It's not a subject I often get into in a great deal of detail. And so I'm going to start this vlog by telling you why I don't do that often, and then I'll talk a little bit more about, well, the role that Qigong does play in relationship to this topic of, things like the meaning of life, understanding our place in life, and dealing with some of the struggles and the challenges that we go through. So I'll talk about 4 different reasons why I don't often go into this subject matter in a lot of detail. So the first reason is that Qigong isn't a religion, and in my opinion you shouldn't really mix the two. There are some exceptions to that. I guess my point being that whether you are Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, atheist, Qigong that shouldn't conflict with your beliefs. Qigong is something much more fundamental. Fundamental might not be the right word. Something much more basic might be a better word than that. It's principles. It certainly can offer great understanding, great insight, but in and of itself, it is not a religion. And if you start to get too much into different perspectives on spirituality, on religion, well, then that can then come into conflict with people's existing beliefs, and there's absolutely no need for that. In my opinion, I don't think it's something that should be done, And so that's one of the reasons why I don't. I keep the Qigong separate, as a separate thing, because it can have value to people from all different spiritual traditions, religions, and in fact it can contribute to their understanding and the richness of their religious experience. I have Qigong students and instructors, actually, people who've done courses and qualified instructors from basically all of those religions I just mentioned. I have Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist. Not sure if I have any religious Taoists, but certainly philosophical Taoists, and atheists. And they all gain benefit from their Qigong practice, and in fact it can contribute to their spiritual or religious beliefs. And I think that's the context where that can be appropriate to talk about, you know, how Qigong intersects with a particular religion, is when, you know, maybe, you know, two Christians are practicing together, talking together, working with Qigong together, and they can, you know, then talk about how it intersects with their Christian faith, or the same if they're Jewish or they're Muslim or whatever, and how that applies, you know, how that applies and supports their faith, but not something that in any way conflicts with it, you know, takes away from it or anything like that. So that is the first reason why I don't often get into some of these topics that people would often think of as more spiritual. So the second reason that I don't often talk about, you know, go into depth with this sort of topic is it's due to the fundamental inaccuracies and distortions that arise, well, with any topic really to some extent, but particularly with these sorts of topics where people are discussing things that there's no hard and fast way to objectively prove, or, you know, to work with these topics. And so they're based often very much on people's hypothesis often, which they then teach as truth rather than as hypothesis, rather than as something that may be true, an idea they've had. And look, even when someone is explaining a principle which is true, and maybe they're completely right, completely accurate, there's this issue of translation. When we put something into words and then communicate it to someone else, that doesn't mean that the other person is going to understand that deep truth for themselves because of what has been said. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not value in this and trying to communicate spiritual ideas, but there is a challenge with that. And my opinion is really that for these spiritual sort of things, really what we need to do is understand them and experience them for ourselves, and not be reliant on, well, this is what someone said, and so therefore I'm going to accept that as the truth. It can be interesting to hear what someone has to say, a model, a concept, an idea, but what's really important is then to, through your own experience, discover and understand that. And this process is really prone to all sorts of issues. So one, that issue of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and another being that, you know, historically we see many examples of where people have used teaching on these topics as ways for control, for manipulation, and so on. And so I think that is something that is best to stay well clear of. I'm happy to, I guess I'll get to that later, I'm happy to talk with people about ways they can discover things for themselves and gain their own knowledge and experience. And that's where the Qigong comes in. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, not so happy to tell them what it is that they should be discovering. Because yeah, I think it's really important for people to learn and experience anything of that nature for themselves, not relying on someone else. So the third reason why I don't often go into a lot of details about these sort of spiritual topics is I don't want to take the role of anyone's guru. Ties in well with that last reason that I was talking about, where there can be this tendency for people when someone starts talking about spiritual concepts and giving guidance on spiritual things, that they then put them in a position of superior knowledge, some kind of superior position. And I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that would be healthy for me. Certainly not. I don't want to be in that position. I don't think it would be good for me. And I don't think it's good for people who then listen to put someone above themselves in terms of, whatever way you want to put it, spiritual knowledge and so on. And so, I definitely want to stay away from that, well away from that. And so, tend to stay well away from the topic. But again, that's not that there's not some value in some aspects of discussing the topic. I had this 2-hour conversation with this friend, but not something I talk about a lot. So that's the third reason. And the fourth reason that I don't often talk about these sorts of topics in any kind of detail is that I think there can be a tendency sometimes for people to look to spiritual solutions, spiritual reasons, spiritual answers to things, sometimes as a way to actually avoid the practical, the obvious, the common sense in a situation. Now, of course, by no means is that always the case, but I think that can be a tendency where people get carried away with high and lofty ideas and ideals to the extent that they neglect what's really important, what's really going to help them. As an example of this, a spiritual example, I'm just going over some rocks here, so excuse me if I have to look down at my feet a little bit. Hang on, there we go, I slipped. Here are the rocks. Yeah, so an example, I'll draw from the Christian religion because it's one that I'm well familiar with, but I think this could probably apply to any religion or spiritual tradition. An example would be someone who gets fascinated and swept away with all sorts of sophisticated doctrines, theories, but maybe they're not putting their effort into being kind and loving their neighbor. One of the most famous teachings of Jesus Christ being, love thy neighbor as thyself. And so they get into the situation where they're really involved and interested in, all these concepts, but they're not putting their effort into the really basic things that are actually the real essence and that are actually going to give them value. And to bring it back to a more Chinese context, there's this saying, I've probably mentioned it on this vlog before and you've probably heard it before, and it says, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And I think there's some real value on many levels to that saying, in that the real spirituality of life is found in the mundane. It's found in the day-to-day. It's found in those things that we do all the time. And if we get carried away by, these ideas that are too lofty, too detached from our everyday activity, well, we're missing the point. And that's often going to feed more into some level of delusion rather than true spirituality. So that's the fourth reason, because I think what people think of as spirituality often actually becomes detached from true spirituality, and I would rather focus people on the practical, the things they can do in the here and now, which have great value and eventually do lead to those spiritual enlightenments. Again, before Enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. There's some implication that the chopping wood and carrying water may have been part of what led to the Enlightenment. And then after Enlightenment, guess what? You carry on chopping wood, carrying water. Okay, so I've given fairly good coverage, I think, to why I don't often talk in a lot of detail about this type of topic. But what does Qigong have to do with this? What role can Qigong play within our spiritual experience of life? Because as I talked about in that blog that I mentioned, that article, many spiritual traditions have traditionally used Qigong as part of their practice. Again, the Qigong is not the religion itself, but they've used Qigong practices as part of what they do to enrich and enhance their spiritual understanding as part of their religion. And so clearly it has some value because it's been used in this way for thousands of years across different spiritual disciplines. And this, I think, it ties very much into the chop wood, carry water. When we within Qigong, we focus in on some of the real basics of life. You know, we focus on our breath, our posture, our movement, our mind, and how these all work together in what we experience. A big part of this then being how the mind, the body, and the breath combine together and direct our energy. And once we start to learn about and observe our energy more closely, this opens up many insights for us. We truly start to understand ourselves better. We start to understand how our thoughts change things within our body, how our emotions affect our energy, and how we can have conscious control over that. We can direct things. Things don't just happen to us so much anymore, but rather we recognize the role that we play in creating our own situation, our own experience of life. It's quite a subtle thing, and you know, some of the things I talk about often, you know, some of the things that I consider practical, maybe some other people would consider to be spiritual. And that's because they're not familiar with working with their mind and body together, being aware of their energy. But to me, that's all practical stuff. And this is the thing that Qigong does for you. It broadens your perception, and it helps you to tune in some more subtle, some finer ways, to discover a new layer of understanding, of nuance, of yourself, of your beliefs, your relationships with others, your emotions, your connection to the environment, and so on. And little by little, as you practice more and more, your understanding and experience of this becomes richer, more nuanced. And that then can lead to your own insights, your own understanding of some of these spiritual concepts that, you know, may form a part of a religion or part of some type of teaching. But it's then grounded in your own experience. You're not relying on just what someone told you. You have your own experience of it, and that helps you to understand it correctly, because it helps to avoid this issue of the communication gap and explain, you know, what is said versus what is understood. You're then, rather than going through a process of, you know, just believing what someone else said or just copying them, you're going through a process where, yeah, instead of your focus being on them, it's on the actual experience. And that gives you a much clearer perception and understanding of that. There's a classic quote from Bruce Lee, an interesting fellow, maybe not the paragon of enlightenment, but he certainly had some interesting things to say from time to time. famous quote. I think it was in Enter the Dragon, I think. And it's right at the beginning of the movie, and he's interacting with a young kung fu student, and he's talking to him about something, and he points at the sky, and the student looks at his hand, looks at his finger, and he slaps him in the head and says, "Don't look at my finger, look at the sky." Because if you're looking at the finger, you're missing all of the heavenly glory. And this is one of the issues that sometimes occurs with different spiritual teachings, spiritual traditions, is people get busy looking at the hand, following the second-hand account of things, rather than having their own experience. So I think that's the role that Qigong plays, and it's very valuable for that. And that's why it's been used in that way for thousands of years, as a way for people to really connect, to have their own experience, rather than relying on second-hand knowledge of concepts which might send them off in the wrong direction. So, what's my approach in teaching Qigong? It's very much to encourage people to chop wood, carry water, and have their own experience. Whenever I teach Qigong, it's very much, even in terms of the Qigong practices, it's not just about the movements, because I don't even want people to just copy the movements. It's useful to copy the movements, learn the movements, but the point is to understand the principles behind them. And by understanding those principles and then experiencing them within a particular movement, you can then gain your own understanding of that principle, which you can apply in many ways, lots of really practical ways in your life, and also eventually leads to a richer understanding, and even spiritual insights as well. So, in the end, as part of this conversation with my friend, because he kept on asking me, I did eventually, towards the very end of the conversation, I did share with him some of my own spiritual insights, insights that I have had, but in the context of having very well discussed with him the value of discovering for himself, and of essentially not just taking whatever I say and going, "Oh yeah, I'll just believe that," but rather that was my perspective on things that I had experienced. And what was really valuable was to tune in and connect with his own energy, with his own experience of life, and through that develop his own experience, his own understanding. So, that is my view on the role that Qigong plays in the path to enlightenment. Enlightenment is often what is held in some spiritual traditions, not necessarily all, as sort of the ultimate goal. To have a greater understanding, perspective of our place in the world, within the universe. I think Qigong can be really, really valuable for that. But a lot of the value of that, I think, comes in discovering it for yourself. There's certainly value in studying different spiritual traditions and having experience with them. I certainly, have done a fair bit of that myself. Certainly I was raised in a Christian environment. I've had exposure in person to Muslim practices, to Buddhist practices, to Taoist practices. I studied East Asian religions in university as one of the papers amongst many others that I studied. And there's value certainly in studying and learning and gaining perspectives from these things. But ultimately what we really want is to have our own experience. And Qigong can really be a valuable part of that, helping us to tune in to some of the subtleties, to be able to experience things in a rich way for ourselves, which is then going to contribute to our spiritual knowledge, our spiritual experience. Anyway, probably a fairly long vlog today. I haven't had a chance to keep track of the time, but I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe there were some useful insights for you in that. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.